Order, order. Mr. May, Mr. Woffenden, welcome. We're very glad to have your help this morning. Both of you have a great deal of experience of looking into and progressing miscarriage of justice cases, either leading campaigns or writing extensively about them. So we're grateful to you and believe that we can gain quite a lot for our inquiry from what you can tell us. What were your hopes for what a kind of body the CCRC would be, and how would you measure how it's been against those hopes?
Shall I start? Well, I'm afraid I think it has been an almost complete failure in terms of what we perceived at the beginning is not what happened. It has led to this for my perspective historically is that in the 70s you had the Sunday Times running campaigns about particular cases. Then there was a change of ownership at the Sunday Times. You got the Independent coming along, and as far as I was concerned, the Independent probably ran something about miscarriages of justice every day for the first 8 years it was going. The Guardian was doing similar things at the same time. That led to, so you got media reports leading to public engagement, leading to representations to MPs, which in turn led to representations to Parliament. So there was a fluid approach there, and people were engaged. From the moment that the CCRC started, that engagement was lost, I think, because what happened was that when people made submissions about particular cases, they then went into this kind of black hole and were not heard of for years. And so the end result of that has been that the public is not as aware, is not as engaged with the process as it used to be. Now, I'm fully aware that the CCRC's work has, of course, led to the overturning of lots of wrongful convictions. But I do believe that the central part of the way justice was within the political process has been lost. And as you know, MPs and ministers will now say, well, it's nothing to do with us, it's all to do with the CCRC.
But members of Parliament would have felt, as we do now when cases like that come to us, that there was a lack of a body which could systematically investigate these cases, a capacity they did not have. The implication of what you're saying is that there was a value in itself in securing justice of the public process, which is not replaced by having a systematic inquiring body to assess whether the cases are well-founded.
Well, yes, to be quite honest, we don't think it's a particularly good inquiring body, and we think that it is only referring a fraction of the cases that it should be referring. That's the problem. And the other area that is particularly important is that it's very likely that as a result of the existence of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, there are more miscarriages of justice now than there used to be. Partly because jurors are perhaps not as committed as they once were. Remember that when the Court of Appeal was set up in 1907, the argument of judges against it was, well, if you have a Court of Appeal, juries will not be as focused on determining guilt or innocence because they will, in effect, mentally be letting someone else decide it if there's a Court of Appeal. And that argument also applies once the CCRC has been set up.
Is there any basis, forgive me for pursuing this, but it's an interesting line of argument, I want to check. Is there any basis for assuming that juries sit in the jury room thinking, well, we could convict him because he could always go to the CCRC if he thinks he's innocent? Okay,
the obvious answer to that is, of course, there's no basis because there's no research into juries. And so I agree with you, it's another, as I put in my submission, there are unknowable areas here, and this is an unknowable area. So I agree, we just have to theorise about it. But that would be my theory, is that there's a kind of Pascal's wager about it, and they're thinking, well, if we let this man off and he commits a string of other offences, then it's down to us. On the other hand, if we convict him and he's innocent, then there are these mechanisms that would allow him to see justice at the end of the day.
So, Mr. May.
Yeah, I think Bob and I have worked on cases in the past, but I would have to beg to differ here. I think, first of all, the expectations at the time, back in 93 or thereabouts, were fairly low. What we wanted was something better than C3 Division of the Home Office. It would have been difficult to come up with anything worse. C3 were unresponsive. They frequently got their facts wrong. They brought massive delay to cases, and we were. And I think, although from a campaigning perspective, I would agree with Bob, we lost a lot of our, of our bag of tricks in pressurising the Home Secretary. Parliamentary questions, early day motions, adjournment debates, but it was a constitutional nonsense. It was wrong that that essentially political pressure could have an influence on whether or not cases got referred. I have no doubt of some of the cases I was involved with before the CCRC. If we hadn't have been pressurising, there would have been no referral. My conscience is clear. These were innocent people who deserved to be released. But one of the disappointments with the Commission is, I think, that they too have continued with accepting delay as some almost immutable law of nature. I won't obviously go into the details of the case, but I chair a support group for Eddie Guilfoyle, who's now been waiting 4.5 years for a decision from the CCRC, which we actually say is a disgrace. Another problem with the Commission is that they're unduly secretive about even the broadest outlines of their investigation. To give a very quick example, again in Eddie Guilfoyle's case, Lord Hunt of Wirral, who is one of Eddie's more prominent supporters, was advised in writing that the Commission had brought in a QC to advise on the case. The Commission hadn't told Mr Guilfoyle's solicitor, let alone Mr Guilfoyle, and we say that they could be a lot more open, a lot more transparent in the way they set about investigations, and indeed a lot more collaborative with representatives and supporters.
Could I just add a couple of points, which is that I knew Tom Sargent quite well in the 80s, and the CCRC arose out of Tom Sargent's arguments about having a court of last resort. And what he envisaged at the time in the 80s is certainly nothing like what we've ended up with, you see. What he envisaged, I think, was that there would be individual cases causing concern, as there was in the 60s, 70s and 80s. There were top-of-the-pile cases that were causing particular concern. I think he thought they would go to an independent commission and be analysed properly away from the Home Office and be cleared up. I don't think anyone envisaged that you'd have a system, as we've got now, whereby thousands of cases are being re-investigated. And one of my concerns, as I put in the submission, is that surely we must be concerned more about the efficacy of the trial process itself, rather than loading it all onto the long stop of the CCRC.
As a practicing barrister myself, I don't actually recognise this sort of jury paralysis that you referred to. In other words, that jurors might skip the difficult question and say, well, somebody above or can look at this again. I don't quite understand that. I don't mean to be playing the devil's advocate. I don't recognise that, actually. I've not had an experience of jurors who've just obviously ducked the difficult question.
Well, I think I've said, one is theorising, but I mean, we simply don't know, because there's no because there's no research into juries. I mean, we have the situation today whereby police officers now sit on juries, which I'd have thought immensely changes the way that juries look at particular cases. But again, we can't say anything about it because we've got no research.
Well, that's true, yes.
Well, you could make the comment, as you've done and quite a few other people have done.
Well, I could make a comment. I don't think it's a particularly good idea, yes. Yeah.
Well, I agree.
The CCRC's referral rate is much higher than C3's was. So quite clearly, some cases are coming through that system, which didn't come through the C3 system, which had all the other defects that Mr. May has just referred to.
Yes, well, from that point of view, at that point of view, the CCRC is obviously a good thing from that point of view, and it has referred a lot of cases. I think, as I said in my submission, though, we should not get overjoyed with their statistics, because I think there are an awful lot of cases that are simply not getting any traction in the CCRC and ought to be. And in fact, there are cases that are causing concern that survive from the 90s. In other words, they are pre-CCRC cases and they are still causing concern today.
There's a whole tranche of cases of institutional historic sex abuse where there are some who protest their innocence, some who have been convicted who protest their innocence, who believe that they've been convicted on as a result of trawling methods used by the police. Are these the kind of cases you would have expected CCRC to deal with, or you would not have expected, as opposed, because they're not the same as the top-level murder cases, which I think you identified as...
Yes, I probably... I mean, I accept what you say about that, and indeed I gave evidence to a different select committee about all those cases some 10 years ago. So obviously one is concerned about those, but I also happen to regard those as very, very difficult. As very difficult to consider, whereas there are a lot of murder cases, and I think I referred in my submission to the Carl Watson case. Now, he's someone who's been fighting his conviction for 20 years and managed to get a success in the civil courts when he won a case against his solicitor for negligence. And at the time, the judge was extremely sympathetic and said, you know, I want a copy of this judgment made at public expense because you will want to use it in a different forum, i.e. in the criminal courts. And he praised his barrister, and what the suggestion was that the judge there firmly believed that, you know, he should be allowed to progress his case on the basis that, if nothing else, that he hadn't had a fair trial. But the CCRC have turned down his case on 4 occasions, I think. And my argument about that is which leads us on to the test, if you like, is that there's the real possibility test, which is a different question to when push comes to shove, will the Court of Appeal actually overturn the conviction? And what seems to me to be happening now, after the CCRC has gained 10 or 15 years' experience of cases, is actually they're vaulting over this first question and going straight on to the second question of what the Court of Appeal is actually going to do, and therefore usurping the role of the Court of Appeal.
We'll come back to that.
Yep.
Mr. Thurid.
Thank you, Chair. In your experience, what level of engagement does the CCRC have throughout the investigation with applicants and also campaigners?
Did you want to do that?
I think this is one of the problems with the variation with case review managers. I chaired and indeed represented Sam Hallam, who was, whose conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal back in 2012. The level of engagement in that case was excellent. The case review manager regularly contacted me with invited submissions as to lines of inquiry they might pursue. There was a Section 19 police inquiry, which we had excellent liaison with. I've had connection with other cases where the case review manager has been reluctant even to say, well, what are you looking at? Because I think in earlier evidence there was a lot of talk of does the Commission go beyond the bundle, as it was termed. In some cases it's useful to do that. In my view, in some cases it's not. In almost every case it's not possible to look at every single aspect of the case. There has to be some agreement as to what the central issues in the case are, rather than some peripheral matter. I also, again, without going into the case details, I actually represent Colin Norris, whose case is with the Commission at the moment, and I've found the case review manager highly receptive to new lines of inquiry. But I do think it's unsatisfactory that we're not working to a protocol. To some extent, it depends how well you, as the representative, do you get on with the case review manager? And it really, you know, I know the Commission is sometimes criticised for not visiting crime scenes, for instance. Well, in some cases it's useful, in other cases it isn't. In Colin's case, for instance, we say there was no crime scene, so there's nowhere to visit. You know, I would certainly like to see the Commission issue more procedural guidance on the level of engagement, you know, and for instance, how
so
frequently...
It's a bit random at the moment, is it?
It's random in terms of it seems to be left too much to the individual CRM,
Yeah.
And there really ought to be some form of protocol, for instance, for meetings.
Yeah.
You know, I've had the experience of asking for meetings and getting no response. Right. On some cases, I've you know, on others, the CRMs have been much more proactive. But I would just add one final point there is, you know, the case review managers are sometimes criticised for not being proactive. I think the representative also has a duty to be proactive, and in too many cases, some solicitors look at the case as if they're just a postbox. They will, you know, that they don't actually do very much active engagement themselves with the Commission.
Sorry, John.
We've received evidence so far so that actually there is a difference in cases between those that are legally represented and supported in that way and those that are not. And those that are represented are significantly more, we think, significantly more successful than those not represented. So there is an issue, is there, about the support that there is for an applicant?
There's an issue, I think, to do with the Court of Appeal that no matter you know how you know knowledgeable or educated a prisoner may be, the Commission looks at these cases in a particular way, and a representative is likely to put the submission in a particular way. Is the evidence credible? Is there a reasonable explanation for the failure to adduce at trial? Is the evidence admissible? These are not issues that most prisoners are able to or even know to address. So inevitably, those with some knowledge of the system representing our clients will have you know, slight advantage, and it has to be borne in mind that you know, I think it's generally accepted that the majority of applications are without merit.
So are you saying that the presence of a legal representative or someone with a good legal background enables the applicant more readily to persuade the CCRC that they've got the basis to go to the Court of Appeal, as opposed to the benefits of having representation in the Court of Appeal itself?
I think the two are separate. There is you know, a benefit in putting the submission in a form that the Commission can recognise. And secondly, there is a benefit. Again, I refer to Colin Norris's case. Colin is a highly thoughtful individual, and he comes up with a suggestion roughly once a week. And mostly, I have to say, I'm sorry, Colin, that wouldn't be admissible.
But shouldn't the CCRC itself be giving some guidance to the applicant as to the kind of questions, kind of issues which would be relevant to submission to the appeal? I
think the Commission issues a limited amount of guidance, but you know, as you know, as those lawyers here will testify, deciding what is and isn't admissible, you know, quite often eludes Queen's Counsel, let alone you know, a prisoner sat in HMP Franklin or wherever. It's difficult issues, and indeed, you know, part of the Commission's problem is the you know, the confused signals that often come out of the Court of Appeal on what it will and won't admit.
But on that, but there are three categories there, more or less on the basis of what you've said. There are entirely unrepresented people, and there are people represented legally by solicitors who may be engaged or may be disengaged. And frankly, I know a number of people who are making representations to the CCRC whose solicitors aren't really doing very much for them, you see. And in fairness, that's because they've got an awful lot else to do, they're not getting paid, etc., etc. But I think there are probably those three categories. But one of the problems, as I see it, with the CCRC itself, is that people think it is going to provide them with an opportunity to overturn the conviction, and all too often it just ends very quickly in nothing at all. And I've just written a book about Charles Ingram, the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire case, on the basis that this was a case where the media conned the nation. But the point about that is that Charles Ingram, who's a highly intelligent person, sends in a submission to the CCRC anticipating that something will happen, because that's what he's been told. And of course, nothing happens at all. There's basically no inquiry.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm not being clear. The point I'm trying to make is your view of the range of support that is available for applicants themselves. And what we're finding, or what we're told, is that if they're legally represented, they stand a better chance. But there's other forms of support as well. I said,
Yes.
Yourselves, for example.
Yes, yeah.
And so the issue of access to support for the applicant is one thing. And of course, then what the CCRC does with the case.
Yeah, I think I'm not a qualified solicitor, nor do I want to be. I do have a law degree and a background going back 30 years. I don't recall a time when it's been more difficult to get a solicitor to take on a case, because although it's outside the remit of the present discussion, the legal aid changes have had a devastating effect on pro bono work with solicitors. You know, I was maybe too critical of solicitors not doing much, because, as Bob points out, many of them are overwhelmed with their, what you might call their paying work. I think the nature of campaigning has changed. Back in the days of the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6, it was predominantly kind of politicised campaigning, because we were pressurising a politician. But it's still important in terms of support for the prisoner to have a support group. It's very often evidentially important. If we hadn't had a support group in Sam Hallam's case, a lot of the evidence that eventually ended up in the Court of Appeal would have never come our way, would never emerged. And thirdly, I think that support does help to educate the will at large. As Bob has referred to, there's been a tailing off, to put it mildly, of public interest in wrongful convictions, but more guidance, more support from the CCRC itself would be welcome. Again, to go back to Sam's case, his family didn't know what to do. It was quite accidental that his family ran into a member of Mr. Corbyn's staff, who in turn knew me. And I don't actually, I don't wish to blow any of our trumpets, but I don't like to think what would have happened to Sam if those coincidences hadn't occurred.
Mr. Fletcher. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Apologies for being late. There was a mess up on the trains this morning. On the last point that you were making, Paul, the coincidence of campaigning is something that is very obvious to me over all these campaigns for injustice, where there is a sort of coincidence of almost good fortune. If somebody meets somebody who knows somebody who can get somebody involved, and somewhere along the line a campaign gets going. You obviously both of you get large numbers of letters and calls from prisons, I'm sure. How do you decide which campaign you will support and which one you don't think has any real possibility of success? And is there any kind of informal network that supports prisoners who are individual, isolated, no support network outside, nothing political, nothing publicly impressive about the case, but nevertheless an injustice may have been done?
Well, should I say something about that? First of all, despite what I may have said originally, I think that is one of the great benefits of the CCRC, is that there are cases which have been paid no attention whatsoever and which nobody knows about, which the CCRC have rectified.
Which would never have got a campaign going.
Which would never have got a campaign going for them. And of course, at the moment, they're particularly engaged with asylum seekers and refugees, and they've got a number of those cases going through. So there are a number of cases like that, and I would certainly praise the CCRC for having got to the bottom of some of those. Yes. With regard to the other point, I mean, there are just speaking for myself, one is just overloaded at the moment, because there are so many cases coming through where people are saying, I've been wrongly convicted. they have, as far as I can see, authentic arguments, and very little is being done about it. But obviously, there's virtually nothing that you can do about it at the moment, and the number of ways in which one can draw public attention to these cases has shriveled immensely.
Yeah, I think I'd back what Bob has to say. There are the obvious no-hopers. I had a prisoner recently write to me who seemed to think that a minor mistake on his previous convictions was enough to invalidate his entire trial. I was again approached by another prisoner who, when I looked into his case, it appeared that he'd been involved possibly in 2 other murders which he'd never been convicted of. So he received a polite letter back. The fact is that, as Bob has said, properly taking on a case is very hard work. I have a shed in my back garden with 45 boxes of case material on Colin Norris's case. All of those pieces of paper need to be read. There are prisoners stuck away in the system who, for whatever reason, no family, no community. In Sam Hallam's case, for instance, the people of Hoxton, on the estates in Hoxton, were hugely important. I went to a meeting expecting to advise 4 or 5 relatives, and wandered into a community of 250 people who turned out by word of mouth. That impressed me. I couldn't imagine that if they thought he was guilty, that those people were there. In the end, I set myself a fairly prosaic target, in a sense, is not to ask is the person innocent, which I personally think is a nonsense. I can't look at somebody and say, yeah, they definitely didn't do it. But I ask myself, in the light of what we now know or can find out, can it still be said that the Crown proved its case beyond reasonable doubt? That for me is enough to keep going. But there are groups like the Innocence Projects. There are dedicated organisations like the Centre for Criminal Appeals. But in the end, there isn't enough support for people claiming innocence. There are cases, which the Court of Appeal is obdurate on. Tony Stock being one.
I think those of us working in this area... Sorry.
Mr. May, you said that the CCRC should meet more applicants, and yet Professor Zander has told us that in his reckoning 90% of applicants to the CCRC have little or no hope. Considering that, how early in the process and with what proportion of applicants should the CCRC be meeting?
I agree with Professor Zander to the point where at stage 1 screening I wouldn't see much value, and in fact it would overwhelm the Commission. They're dealing with 1,500 applications a year. I'm due up at HMP Franklin next week. I live in York, which isn't very far away. It's still going to take all of my day to be there and back. But once a case has passed stage 1 screening and is at stage 2 for investigation, in my view, I've expressed this repeatedly with case review managers, they should meet with the applicants. My experience is that case review managers tend to be very reluctant. For instance, Colin Norris, the case review manager, has had the case for 2 years now. She's only recently agreed to visit him. The Royal Commission itself recommended that this was one of the major concerns that prisoners had, that they didn't get to see the people dealing with their cases. And I would say, of the 10% that get to stage 2, I think it should be built into the procedure. They should visit the prisoner of the stage 2 applications.
A further point on this, of course, is that you have referred earlier, and also now, to the engagement of the managers, the case review managers. But in your experience, how experienced are they in actual fact?
I think on the whole they're pretty experienced. It's in some senses it worries me that this random allocation of cases, because that doesn't necessarily play to the strengths of case review managers. although it can be made up for by the commissioner appointed. For example, Colin Norris involves basically the frontiers of human knowledge when it comes to endocrinology, not necessarily something that a lawyer would understand. Fortunately, we have a commissioner overseeing the case who's both a barrister and a medical doctor and an ex-NHS Trust chair. So the experience of the case review managers, I think, on the whole, is adequate, but it depends on the case. It wouldn't have done in Sam Hallam's case, for instance, to have had a scientist, because there was no science in the case. I was very pleased that the case review manager there was an experienced lawyer and understood some of the legal issues involved in Sam's case. But one problem we often encounter is case review managers not necessarily thinking that a particular piece of evidence is worthwhile. I had the devil's own job with Sam Hallam's case review manager to persuade him that obtaining his mobile phone was the most important part of the case. As soon as Thames Valley Police took over, it was the very first thing that the senior investigation officer said to me, "We'll get that mobile phone." And as was well known at the time, it was that mobile phone that was the most crucial piece of evidence in the case.
Yeah. So I get the impression really that in some ways the manager should perhaps even specialise in certain types of, if a person is scientifically qualified as well, then clearly if a case comes in with a lot of science involved, then that's a case for him or her, isn't it?
It would mean a different method of allocation of cases. I don't know what you...
Well, entirely. The stumbling block, surely, is the Court of Appeal, you see, and all this business about expert evidence at court. And the Court of Appeal's doctrine that you can't simply supplant one expert with another, you see. A case I'm dealing with at the moment is called John Rhee. He's Korean, Jongree, who was convicted of murdering his wife through arson in 1997. And the person who gave evidence as an expert at trial, I think we can probably describe as a charlatan. He's dead now, so there's no legal problems with that. Since then, there have been, the major fire experts in this country. Professor Roger Berwick, for example, has described the original fire expert as dangerous in the criminal courts. And yet he is still in prison 18 years later on the basis of ridiculous evidence.
I'm anxious that we're able to get to the Court of Appeal issue, which is the next topic.
I've got two further questions, if I may. I don't want to hog the session, but I would like, if you could respond to them. Research has shown that the CCRC go beyond the bundle you referred earlier to, beyond the bundle in investigations, in just over a third of the cases. How proactive do you expect them to be in investigating applications, both at the screening stage and throughout the investigation? And how does this match up with the reality of what you've seen? Is the CCRC unduly insistent on fresh evidence?
Well, from my experience, I think we are often presenting fresh evidence which it tries to debunk in some way and doesn't show a great deal of interest in. I would argue that I think it does feel restricted by what it knows the Court of Appeal is going to allow at the end of the day. Should it be more proactive? Well, yes, it should in lots of cases.
Yeah, I think this is a difficult area because the assumption is in some quarters that the CCRC should always go beyond the bundle. I've referred to Eddie Guilfoyle's case. There was 300 pages of evidence put in by Mr. Guilfoyle's lawyers. We wouldn't attempt to dissuade the Commission from looking beyond the issues raised, and there are many, but it's not absolutely necessary. Conversely, I knew that the evidence we were able to put forward in Sam Hallam's case wasn't on its own enough. But we didn't have access to the police national computer, let alone to police property, let alone to various of the witnesses. So I think there should be more of a dialogue between applicants, representatives and the Commission as to the extent to which it's felt that matters not raised with the Commission should be looked into. The Commission has recently, and this is potentially a problem, is taking a much firmer line on late submissions, as they term them. I had some difficulty in persuading the Commission to accept a late submission in the case of Colin Norris when I took over as his representative. I can understand why the Commission is saying that, but in the course of a case, new information will come in all the time.
And in the interest of justice, they should be allowed in, shouldn't it?
Will you succeed in the end in persuading them to?
Sorry?
Did you succeed in the end?
Yes, I mean, I say I had some difficulty. It only took 36 hours, but I did have to make additional representations on why they should accept the representations. As you say, in the interest of justice, I think they should always, unless it's, patently ridiculous submission. Again, as Bob has referred to, we've got the Court of Appeal's rather arcane rules to look at as well in terms
let's get on to it. Mr. Howell.
Thank you.
Can I take you back to the and to really ask you the question: is much of the criticism levelled at the CCRC not better directed at the Court of Appeal? And can you expand on some of the issues that you've been mentioning about the Court of Appeal?
Yes, well, we'd certainly agree with that, and there are probably 4 areas in particular. So one we just mentioned is expert evidence, when the expert evidence at trial may not actually have been that expert at all. The second very important area is competence of counsel, which is extraordinary. We have good and bad architects and good and bad journalists, but all barristers, it seems, are supposed to be absolutely perfect. So one of the criticisms of the CCRC is that if this issue arises, then they actually compound the problems, you see, because the CCRC always go back to the original trial lawyers and ask for their views on a case. And I think we know of instances where the original counsel are simply lying to protect their own positions rather than to advance the interests of their erstwhile clients. And there are a couple of cases where we suspect that is what has happened. In fairness to the barristers, they themselves are in a very difficult position because we know of the stigma that attaches to professional, incompetence in a particular case. And I think I did refer in my submission to the Reith lectures this year, which were about mistakes made in medicine, you see. And no one worries about them. Everyone just says, well, let's make sure we get it better. Whereas we still have a system in criminal law whereby if barristers get it wrong at trial, that's it. It's the wrongly convicted appellant or who pays the price of that difficulty. And the other areas with appeal are that we need to take into account the whole of the case, I think. If you look at the Jeremy Bamber case, for example, there are very sound grounds for saying that Jeremy Bamber's case should be referred to appeal on the grounds that the case as it stands now is not in any way the case as it was originally when he was convicted. The problem with that is that Bamber is, from my perspective, obviously guilty. And I think the CCRC have taken that into account. So from that point of view, they have examined the whole of the case and said, well, he's guilty and we're not going to entertain his submission. That doesn't seem to apply on the other side. If someone is innocent, they will maybe find particular reasons to disregard pieces of evidence instead of taking a view of the whole of the case and how it coheres.
Yeah, I think if I had to pick up one area with the Court of Appeal, it would be this issue of new evidence, which I think is actually within the gift of Parliament to change to Section 23D of the 68 Criminal Appeal Act. We've been moving backwards in recent years on what evidence the Court of Appeal will accept as new. Where the previous Lord Chief Justice, the Lord Judge, basically developed the so-called one trial principle, which is if the evidence was in question was capable of being adduced at trial, but wasn't, that's it. It's inadmissible. And that, I'm currently arguing on Colin Norris's case on that very point with the Commission. Very often you will have a piece of evidence which at time of trial made no sense because you couldn't link it with other pieces of evidence. What the court is increasingly saying is if it was available to the defence at trial, that's your lot. There was a good example from Sam Hallam. We had a witness who at time of trial said he'd seen Sam Hallam outside the pub that it turned out he was at. But until years later, a mobile photograph showed that he'd been at that pub and had been mistaken about his whereabouts. The witness's statement made no sense at the time, therefore the defence didn't enter it in evidence. At the Court of Appeal years later, the court said, no, sorry, you could have put this forward at trial. So we're not rendering it, we're not deeming it admissible now. In my view, the court should focus on the fact that the evidence wasn't presented, not on the reasons why it might not have been presented, because it's basically it's unjust to have evidence which has never been considered by a court ruled out of order. And in so many cases, I think I agree with everything Bob has had to say, but I have a particular hobby horse on Section 23 of the Criminal Procedure Investigation Act. This is the duty on the police to pursue reasonable lines of inquiry. These days, on the whole, we hope, suspects aren't beaten to within an inch of their lives like the Birmingham Six. But so many miscarriages are about tunnel vision, about conclusion-driven inquiries. In other words, the police not following, or police officers not following their statutory duty to pursue all reasonable lines of inquiry. I had something we were running with.
I think we're getting a little away from the point when you asked about answered very clearly a moment ago, and I'd rather we stuck with that.
Thanks very much.
Well, I was thinking more that the Court of Appeal should be upholding that right, and they're not doing it.
Okay, okay. Can we go on to the real possibility test, and what changes are required to that to perhaps nudge the CCRC into being less cautious or less deferential?
Well, I think I've already mentioned that what happens is the CCRC seem to have vaulted over this test and gone to the second test. And is the Court of Appeal actually going to overturn the conviction? Which, in my view, is not what they should be doing. They should be just saying, is there evidence here that in a way undermines what happens at trial, and therefore it should be considered again at the Court of Appeal. I have suggested, in my opinion, the CCRC should simply be saying that the test that they should be asked to answer is, if you were constituted as a jury, then in view of all the evidence you have seen, would you have found this particular person guilty? Because it seems to me that if the answer is no, then that's enough, that the case has not satisfied what we need it to satisfy within the criminal justice system. There are obviously flaws there, there are obviously doubts, and that is a logical and a natural test for them. I mean, as it happens, there's slightly more than 12 commissioners, but they're almost constituted as a jury anyway. This would not be taking over from the actual jury test, because this would be a hypothetical test, not the actual test, but it is a natural and logical test for them to perform. And if they can't answer it in the affirmative, if they can't say we would have found this person guilty, then, as I say, the case can't satisfy the demands that it should satisfy.
You've argued for the repeal of Section 315 of the Criminal Justice Act. Would you like to expand on that?
Well, I think it was extraordinary. As I remember, this particular section was pushed through by a couple of law lords late at night and was hardly ever debated by Parliament anyway. I think most lawyers will tell you that they are representing their clients, not anybody else, and therefore it is up to them to determine the grounds on which the case is going to be heard as appeal. And they may not be the grounds which have been determined by the CCRC. There's one particular case called Atwell Roden, a South Wales case, where the barrister, whom, as I recall, was Henry Blaxland, could only argue on the basis of the two grounds put forward by the CCRC. And when he asked if he could stray outside those areas, the judges said, well, if you can fit them into those areas, then we'll hear your arguments, as it were. And I think barristers, QCs should be allowed a free hand, really, once the case has been referred to appeal.
Yeah, if I could just add, that was a problem we had at Sam Hallam's appeal. There were two important pieces of evidence which weren't in the Commission's statement of reasons, that specific leave of the court had to be obtained, one of which loomed quite large in the court's eventual judgment as its reasons for quashing the conviction. It really it should be repealed. I would agree with Bob, because it was never really that clear why Parliament passed the legislation. It's always been the case that the clock was turned back to zero once you had a referral. You could put forward any admissible grounds of appeal, and I can't see why you can't now.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald.
We're looking at the resources of the CCRC. Could you tell us what you think about the level of additional funding and resources that are required for the CCRC to fulfil its duties?
I think we could just go back to 2002 when the Commission had 50 case review managers. They have 34 now. Their workload has doubled. That's absurd. And one major concern is that they're increasingly appointing case review managers on fixed-term contracts.
Right.
Part of the reason for the delay in Eddie Guilfoyle's case was 18 months into his case, the case review manager got promoted. We ended up back at square one with a new case review manager. Why they couldn't have made some arrangement internally, I don't know. But I've been speaking to a case review manager recently who says her workload has tripled in the last 12 months. We can criticise the Commission all we like for not looking at cases thoroughly, but if they're going to be dealing with that kind of unreasonable workload increase, they should be properly funded. And I would say take 2002 as the start point, and enough funding for 50 case review managers.
Well, I agree with all of that. The points I made in my submission were obviously that I do believe there's a danger of us focusing on the wrong thing here, and the idea that we should create this system that we see just stretching off, for years to come, just seems to me absurd. Why can't we get it right first time? Why can't we focus on making sure that the trial process gets it right first time? Instead of which, I have to say, there have been loads of legal changes in recent years, this century, that have actually encouraged wrongful convictions. I mean, hearsay evidence, anonymous evidence, etc., you see. And we've mentioned police officers sitting on juries. So we're actually going the wrong way, from my perspective, in that we need to make sure that the system functions properly first time, because it's just creating awful, it's costing the country millions of pounds, and is creating awful distress for families, both the wrongly imprisoned and the victims and bereaved. And there should be more attention, I believe, put to absolutely getting right first time. And though I accept that obviously there is a lot that the Criminal Cases Review Commission is doing well, but I also think it should have some sort of time limit and should be told, well, let's clear up the system in 5 or 10 years or whatever it is. We shouldn't just perpetuate this thing forever.
I'll come back to Mr. Gordon.
Would it be practical to put a time limit on the CCRC in response to queries, so it would have to make an initial decision on the possibility of a review or not, and then a timetable by which it has to reply. And it seems to me that there's a bigger and bigger backlog developing in the CCRC, and so we're going to end up with some kind of CCRC plus to look at the CCRC backlog. It's like there's a kind of eternal growth of the backlog.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's the old argument, isn't it? These things, once they're starting, they grow like Topsy. Yeah, yes, the old argument. So there is the point about resources again, but yes, I mean, as far as we can see, they seem to have no conception of how this is affecting the person in prison and his family, his relatives, etc. You know, people are dying while they're in prison. I mean, Gordon Park, the lady in the Lake case, was one I dealt with. When Gordon Park's appeal failed, he was in such despair that he committed suicide. You know? But
there are cases where there clearly is no real merit in reference anywhere.
Yeah.
There is no new evidence. There's no basis for it. Those seem to take as long to be told they have no basis as those people that clearly do have a basis. Is there a case, that's what I'm saying, for an initial observation to come very quickly from the CCRC?
A sort of trial.
Is that possible?
Well, it tends to happen with the stage 1 screening.
Yes, it should happen.
But there's no merit. They do have targets for that. One slight reservation I have about setting time limits is I found myself in the position of, on occasion, of arguing with the Commission, please don't make a decision yet, we're getting more evidence together. Again, on Colin Norris, they indicated they were going into decision-making phase, and I begged them not to, you know, while we got the fresh evidence into them.
Yeah, but that's entirely reasonable. If a credible person says, I've got evidence that I believe is going to come forward, then that's perfectly reasonable as a basis for not making a decision.
But, I mean, certainly the cases that are entirely without merit, I think they do have some targets, but one of the many problems is the waiting time. Once it's been decided there's something to look at before you get a case review manager. It was 7 months in Sam Hallam's case. I think it's now longer for persons in custody. That is a very frustrating time, particularly in cases where time itself is a factor. In Sam Hallam's case, a lot of his case was about witnesses. Witnesses' memories fade, you know, and it was very frustrating month after month knowing that basically his submission was sitting in a tray somewhere. Certainly I think there's a case for some external setting of targets to the Commission, but at the same time they need the resources to actually keep to those targets.
Because we have justice matters on the floor of the House very shortly, we're down to our last few minutes, Mr. Woodard.
Paul, you mentioned in your written evidence issues with public bodies complying with Section 17 request for disclosure. How well does the CCRC chase these matters up, and what further measures are needed?
Well, as I indicated, I'm surprised this hasn't received more attention. There are no sanctions for any public official or public body failing or even outright refusing to supply information. Now, again, I mentioned in my written submission, it's a health trust that 2 years refused, point blank refused, to supply information to the Commission. In Sam Hallam's case, the senior investigating officer of the original murder inquiry, same officer who was involved in the Gareth Williams spy in the bag case, point blank refused to be interviewed by his fellow officers. There were no, there were no sanctions, and in the end, the Commission is forced to cajole. I mentioned earlier that the Commissioner overseeing Colin Norris's case is herself a former NHS Chief Executive. I understand that's how it was resolved on a Chief Executive to Chief Executive basis. That's completely unsatisfactory, and there should be some sanctions on public bodies that refuse to comply, and indeed, should Parliament, as we all, I think, advocate, should it be extended to private bodies, the same sanctions, but at the moment, the Section 17 duty is toothless.
And the other factor is the public bodies that are becoming private bodies.
Yeah,
of course.
Forensic science and everything.
Just on this issue of resources, should trivial and sentence-only cases be removed from the CCRC's remit? And that would allow it to focus more on the more serious cases?
Well, those people want justice too, don't they? So it is difficult. So on the whole, I would say no. I mean, I think pocket cases should actually be brought within the remit of the CCRC, because that's an area in which people feel great injustice, because lots of middle-class families are suffering a lot at the moment under what appear to be spurious claims made by the authorities after particular convictions, and that seems to me, as I say, a growing area of injustice that might well be tacked on to the CCRC's remit. So I think there are problems, and notwithstanding, despite what I've said, I would say no, I think they should consider those cases.
Yeah, I think I'd add that the Court of Appeal very early on in the case of Graham largely took away the CCRC's powers in relation to sentencing. I would argue in complete defiance of Parliament's intentions. But if the CCRC isn't able to refer sentencing cases, who's going to do it?
Well, just finally, the Royal Commission didn't envisage this, but is there merit in the CCRC playing a more campaigning role in terms of being more vocal about the causes of miscarriages of justice and the need to reform the criminal justice system overall? To a certain extent, it touches some issues, Bob, that you've raised.
Well, I'm astonished that they haven't been more proactive in those areas, and it seems to me there are lots of instances where the CCRC should have been more publicly involved. Originally perhaps with the Sally Clark case, because there were other cases like that, and there are various areas like that going right down to today with the fake shape cases, that when the judge says, oh, we can't believe a word he says, the CCRC seem to me to do nothing, and the CPS says, oh, well, maybe we'll look at these cases. Actually, the CCRC, I think, should have stepped in and said, we'll have a look at these convictions in the light of what this judge has said. And obviously, if they can deal with cases in clusters like that, I mean, Paul has mentioned the Colin Norris case, and I've been involved with the Dee Windsor case, which is exactly a parallel case. They should be doing those together, I think, rather than separately all the time.
By drawing general conclusions about miscarriages?
And I believe drawing general conclusions, as we've just talked about this morning, ways in which the judicial system can be improved.
Yeah, and certainly, as I touched on the issue of police inquiries and pursuing reasonable lines of inquiry. There are common themes that emerge from these cases, and I think the Commission is rather poor, even in its annual report, at drawing conclusions. Yes, in that limited sense, a campaigning role, drawing attention to particular areas of concern.
Thank you very much indeed. We're very grateful to you both for giving us the benefit of your experience.